Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and this is entry 29 in my series of videos for participation in the RPG A Day event for 2017. If this is your first video in this series you're watching, this is an event where every day we answer a different question relating to role-playing games for the month of August 2017. Today's question, I am again going off script from the prepared questions because I don't really have much to say about the question that I'm asked to answer. So instead, I'm going with one of the questions from one of my fellow YouTubers, Runeslinger. I've been prepping for a D&D 4th edition game that happens to have a character playing a rune priest, so I'm a bit in the Runesmith vein right now. Runeslinger has proposed a series of alternate questions on his excellent blog, Casting Shadows. The question I'm going to deal with today is suggest an RPG with engaging solo play. I thought that was an interesting question because it's generally, I mean, like, this is a team activity where you're going to have more than one player, and it's not necessarily always a one player, one DM. Though, I mean, to be honest, like, for a good long time when I was a kid, that's sort of how we played most times. We only really, when I was growing up, I only really had a group of about four or five of us who really, you know, were heavily invested in role-playing games. So I usually, most of my games were either solo games or one or two, two or three other, two or three players. But so, I mean, I mentioned that only to say that I don't find solo play as unusual as maybe a lot of other groups do, because that's, yeah, I mean, I'm used to running things that way. That's been most, you know, the way that we run things most times, at least particularly when we were kids. But after thinking about this question as to, you know, what RPG might best engage solo play, I don't have an answer for a specific RPG, but I do have an answer, I think, for how to set up the RPG. So traditional RPG, well, there's different ways to set up your campaign, and broadly speaking, those can be, you know, the sort of extremes are sandbox on one side, in the sense that you have characters who are going to be able to go around and get in adventures with a world that is responding to what they're doing, but largely they're sort of left to their own devices to figure out what they want to be doing. The other extreme of that is scripted, which is, going to have there's a specific story or like plot line that the characters are going to be following through. I think that the best way to set up solo play is probably to go sandbox. I mean, it's solo play. Well, maybe it's just that I think maybe this is solo play is where you can go the extremes, maybe in either direction. Solo play, you only really need, so if you're going with a scripted kind of storyline, like a plot storyline, solo play requires you to only keep track of one player or one player character. So you can really focus all of your story efforts on just driving that one narrative forward. So if you have a specific plot in mind or story in mind that you have for that character, and you want them, you know, the players the player is good to go through, then, I mean, you really do have the opportunity to do as much as to feature as much of the campaign with them in the spotlight, which is kind of cool for a story type campaign. That means they're always the ones who are primarily being, having the spotlight shown on them. The other extreme is to go completely sandbox the other way, where the players, the onus is on them to kind of, you know, bop around and find out what's going on, and then as they interact with the world, they'll figure out what they want to do and what things are available, and then they'll meet allies and adversaries, and the campaign will, you know, organically develop from that. The scripted one, I mean, I think is probably easier to recognize as being, the way to run a solo campaign, and that I don't think is restricted by any specific type of game. You know, like, you can run a scripted campaign with any role-playing game, so I don't necessarily think that there's one that supports solo play necessarily better. But with solo play, you really do have the freedom to make a fairly heavily scripted story that is just about that player, or about that player character, I should say, not the player necessarily. And you also have the opportunity to really shake things up specific for that character. So, you know, if you want the character to be thrown into prison or like shipped off to another land, or, you know, to lose their job and their friends and whatever else, and have a real big shakeup, you know, in the campaign world, it's a lot easier to do for one player than it is for necessarily a bunch of other ones. So I guess that's one way of going to the extreme. The alternate is to go sandbox. And the example I'm thinking of is on there is a web series, so the YouTube channel called Dawnforge Cast that does a lot of stuff for 5th edition D&D and some stuff for Pathfinder as well. The Pathfinder stuff is more dated. And it's an interesting site. I mean, like if you're really into 5th edition D&D, it's got tons of stuff for you on that. I think it's more geared towards starting players, so I don't find a lot of the analysis terribly helpful. But it's still good material. It's just that I'm not the audience for that. However, there was a brief period where the guy who hosts that channel had another guy run a Shadowrun Shadowrun solo campaign for him. And it was set up as a very, very sandbox thing. He kind of got, you know, picked up from where he was and dropped into this environment. And most of the campaign was him going out and finding out sort of what jobs were available and taking jobs to try to, because he had no money. He was sort of having to you know, fend for himself. And it was great. It was really like unfortunately the campaign is on indefinite hiatus right now. I think maybe because there's only so many hours in his day, and you know, the focus of that channel is Dungeons and Dragons, not Shadowrun. But man, it was a really great campaign. It actually got my my interest peaked to running a Shadowrun game again. Maybe I'll include a link to those series of videos if I can find a playlist for that on his channel. I'll include the link below. But it was I thought a really good way of setting up a solo campaign, of setting up so that you just let the characters go around, you know, and I think the advantage there is that the players are the ones is the one who's in the driver's seat. So, you know, inevitably people are going to think a little bit about their game when they're away from the table, you know. But I think a sandbox game, having run a little bit of Blades in the Dark recently, which is a very, very sandbox game, that game I think stays with you and you get more plotting and planning you can do. You can think about the game beyond just reflecting on what happened in between the game with sandbox games. And I think that's something that with solo play is maybe a little more desirous than just people thinking about, wow, what an awesome story you told. I think that maybe there's more value there in running a sandbox type thing, because, you know, the story it's only, I guess, for one thing, one problem you can run into in a sandbox campaign is if people decide that their characters want to pursue different sort of avenues. That can, I guess, cause a problem because you're splitting the party and you're splitting the focus, and it's hard for that emergent storytelling to crystallize the way that it does or it's supposed to in sandbox campaigns. But with only one player, you got that player engaged at the time, because they're the ones who are having to think of what they want to be doing and where they want to be going. And I think that also gives that player something to think about for the game, something to engage with in between, because they're going to be planning what to do in between sessions as well. And that's the thing lately I've really been enjoying, is when I'm able to, when there are things going on in the campaign that are beyond the table, that's where I really, you know, for myself, my regular sessions are once a week on Wednesdays for 2 hours, and then every 2 weeks on Fridays for 4 hours, every second Friday. I'm also going to be starting off with a playing actually in a D&D campaign too, which will be a very sandbox thing. But it's going to be interesting because I think that game will likely help me test my theory I'm also, as I shouldn't say it, I'm also kicking off a Kingmaker Pathfinder game, running the Kingmaker storyline for one player of mine. One thing that I guess I would mention too, just in terms of solo play, is the question of whether you have one character or multiple characters. Now, obviously, the way most people play role-playing games is one player per one character. But there's been a lot of times in the last few years where I've been running things where because we've got fewer players and I want to give them the opportunity to for different reasons, either because I wanted to have all the roles filled in a certain game, like in D&D 4th edition, you have the different roles, and I wanted to make sure that all the roles were sort of filled. So between my two players, they were playing 5 characters. Actually, in my I run a 4th edition Eberron campaign where people play 2 characters each in that. My Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign has the players playing either 2 or 3 characters each as well. And my solo Pathfinder game has 3 player, one player playing 3 characters. Now, that's a decision that I think that it has to be right for the players and for the DM, and it has to feature, you do have to do a good job, I think, of both the players and the DM distinguishing between those characters to make the role-playing element and the role-playing aspect of solo play good, so that they know, the way that a certain character would react to something is different from the way a different character would react to things. But I think that one of the advantages to doing that with solo play is, and this is going back to my Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign, that campaign was kicked off initially with the idea being that I knew how lethal the game was, and I wanted the player to have some cushion. In the event that 1 or 2 of the characters died, they'd always have 1 more kicking around. The characters have been a lot more careful, but in that first session, 1 character died. What I decided to do, because I could tie it into the ongoing campaign, is he came back as a revenant. So he's been undead, and that character has died about once in an adventure. So they're 5th level now. I think they've died 5 times. But I've also made it clear for the way that I'm going to run the Kingmaker campaign. The reason I got the player to make 3 characters for that too is I'm letting the dice fall where they may with that. It's a very sandbox style campaign, and I'm gonna let the dice fall where they may. If that means 1 or 2 of those characters die, I'll let them player roll up replacements for them. But I want to. I don't want to be treating that one with kid gloves. And if there was only a single player a single player with a single character playing that campaign, I think that that campaign would effectively be done if that character died, which means that you either have to just make sure the characters don't die, or you have to come up with some cockamamie reason for why this new player is going to be suddenly invested back in the world that the previous character was involved in. But anyway, so those are my thoughts on solo play, and what games or what setup you want to or approach, I suppose, you would maybe want to consider for when setting up something that's going to be a solo game. Again, I don't think there's necessarily one game system that is better or worse than that. I think that all systems, I guess the one thing I would suggest is that the level of complexity of the game will matter in terms of how many player characters you want to allow the players to have. For instance, as much as I did run the my couple D&D 4th edition campaigns with players playing multiple characters, and my Shadow of the Demon Lord one has multiple characters, I'm not doing that again. That's not my preferred way of running it. And once players get their characters, though, they don't want to say goodbye to them. They don't want to have them die. They don't want to just leave them aside, because like back when I was running 4th edition more regularly, I'm hoping to be doing that again soon, but this is going back a few years. What I tried to do to try and speed up play, because the players were spending too much time looking through their characters' sheets. They're trying to figure out what they were going to do each round. And it's not because they weren't being diligent, it's because there's a shit ton of stuff to track with 3 4th edition D&D characters, and in the campaign that I'm thinking of, where they were playing 2 and 3 characters, that ran between 7th and 12th level. So once you hit the 10th level and above, you enter the Paragon tier, and characters get significantly more complex then. So I had tried at one point to replace the characters. I talked to the guys about my concern that it was taking too long to go through combat. They felt otherwise, and my suggestion was to try and use those, pick one character to be a primary and then have the others be sort of supporting characters, because there's great rules in the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide 2 that suggest for how to build companions in a very nice little streamlined package. They still will feel very similar to what the full characters feel like, but they won't have the massive list of options available. Well, my players didn't want to go for that. They did not like that idea at all. So we carried on with the full characters as is. Shadow of the Demon Lord as well too. I won't kill off the characters or make the players in that campaign cut down to 1. We're approaching end game right now, so we're 6th level right now, and we're going to be 7th at the end of this next adventure. So I'm not going to kill off the characters or anything like that. But for ongoing campaigns going forward, I will definitely have one player to one character, unless it is a solo campaign. The solo campaign will depend also on the complexity. Pathfinder, I don't find, is at the levels that I will be running it at, is not going to be terribly complex. There's not so many things to track that it's impossible. That said, I mean, if I was in the same boat, I would not run a Shadowrun game, for instance, with 3 characters. I would have 1 character. I think that's a point as well. So maybe it's not actually the complexity, it's the fragility of the characters. If I was starting my Pathfinder game off at, say, 3rd level, I'm not sure I would be so attached to having that player have 3 characters. Maybe I would, I would allow him to have some NPC hirelings that I'd let him make combat rolls for, but I wouldn't have him role-playing them. Maybe instead, what I would do is just let him play the 1 character. My concern, my reason for letting this my buddy play 3 characters in that one is because first level Pathfinder characters are notoriously fragile. Like they dish out a lot of damage. Don't get me wrong, but in a campaign that's a sandbox campaign where there's gonna be random encounters and stuff like that, 3 goblins with ill intent can take down a first level character pretty easily. So those first couple of levels can be a little touch and go, which is the feel I want for this particular campaign, but I also don't want to have the player die or see the strings I'm pulling to keep them alive. So so that's maybe a factor to consider in whether you want, for a solo campaign, the players to be playing 1 character or multiple characters, is just how fragile they are and the ability of the campaign to recover from those characters' deaths. So yeah, anyway, those are my thoughts on solo play. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns regarding this, please do not hesitate to leave a comment in the section below. I'd also be interested in hearing how you folks handle solo play. Is there a specific approach to the campaign you use? Is there you do the same thing that I do, where depending on the game, you give characters or players more than 1 character to play, or do you let it just rise and fall on the fate of one character? So anyway, tomorrow's question will be, let's see, the default question. I think I looked ahead and I was not crazy about that question, so I think I'll be doing one of Runeslinger's questions again. But let's take a look. So the last 2 days, because we're coming up on 30 and 31. 30 is, what is an RPG genre mashup you would like most to see? And then, what do you anticipate most for gaming in 2018? Actually, those are pretty good questions. So maybe I will go back to the default questions again. So tomorrow I'll be addressing the question, what is an RPG genre mashup you would most like to see? So let me think about that between now and tomorrow, and I will see what I have to say tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I will look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. See ya.